Russia tomorrow.
Mr. Bildt, thank you so much. Good to see you on TV Rain again. First of all, I would like to ask you about the new package of sanctions that were imposed by the European Union. It's the 9th package already. And after 10 months of war, we can see that the engines for drones are banned by European Union. And also there are Russian propaganda television channels which are banned after all these months. We're a little bit confused here. What is that? I mean, how could you explain that for so many months these things were okay and they were normal for the European countries?
Well, I don't think they were neither normal nor accepted, but the work with the sanctions is a fairly complicated one in the European Union, because sanctions is not something that you just decide like that. There has to be sort of a legal framework for it. It has to be legally correct. It has to stand the challenge in court. That means that it is a step-by-step process. And it obviously started with the bigger items that were immediately available, immediately evident, immediately possible to do, and then it works gradually. So I think you will see more packages of sanctions, and primarily, and that was perhaps even more important, that was decided the other day, to start to setting up structures to really make certain that sanctions are implemented. Because taking the decisions is one thing, implementing is another one.
Mm-hmm. And what's the problem with the implementation?
The implementation is that it's very complicated in different jurisdictions to make it really work. I mean, to check all of these things. I mean, we are talking in terms of technology sanctions. We should be aware of that the Kremlin, Moscow, is setting up a fairly elaborate network in order to try to evade the sanctions. You set up shell companies, so you set companies in other countries, and you sort of export it back and forth between different places, and then eventually they end up in Russia where they shouldn't be. So setting up the structures to really implement the sanctions isn't done over a weekend, to put it in those terms.
I got it. There were some publications recently about how Russia avoids the sanctions, including, I think it was Reuters, which published a big article about Russia getting technologies from Western countries, and with the help of one Turkish company, but it doesn't matter. There are different ways of getting these banned things to Russia. Is there a possibility, Mr. Bildt, in your opinion, to control this flow of banned things to Russia?
I don't think it's ever going to be 100%. And we have experience from sort of other cases, Iran, North Korea, to take sort of more recent cases. We have the old example of the Soviet Union, where all of these regimes do set up different structures in order to try to circumvent and evade the sanctions. And they normally succeed with something. But overall, if we succeed with 80 or 90% of the implementation, there's a certain amount of leakage. The effect of the sanctions are going to be dramatic over time.
This conversation with you, to me, is something like, wrap up of the year. And if we talk about the sanctions and efficiency of sanctions, how could you evaluate, Mr. Bildt? Honestly saying, sometimes we have some doubts about the, effectiveness of this measures taken by the Western world, because Vladimir Putin is still there and he fights the war in Ukraine. The invasion has not stopped, and the sanctions did not stop anyone. So, what is the reason? What is the reason to implement the sanctions? And do you think they do work?
Sanctions are only one instrument of policy. It can never work in isolation. It can never work short term. It worked long term and part of the overall policies. I think the number one effort that is needed, and that's of course ongoing, is for Ukrainians to defend themselves and for the West to help them in all of the different ways that we are trying to help them. Then sanctions do reinforce the message, and sanctions makes it more difficult for the Kremlin leadership to reconstitute their primarily military strength, but also strength of the economy that sustains the war effort. But it doesn't happen in a week, it doesn't even happen in a month, but it happens over a prolonged period of time.
Going back, just one follow-up question about Russian channels, propaganda channels, which are banned now after 10 months of the war. Why do you think no one paid attention to the fact that they still had a license in Europe? How come?
Well, and some of them, if you take RT, for example, they still have a license in the United States. I've been in Washington now for a couple of days. I've been watching RT just to see what trash they are putting out. These other channels that were now banned, I have to confess, I wasn't aware of them. And one of the reasons why they were neglected was probably because they had a very, very limited impact, a very, very limited audience. Might be that they should have been banned earlier, but now it's done.
Mm-hmm. No, okay. There are several publications during this couple of days about the war. And there are suggestions that Russian Federation Vladimir Putin will become even more aggressive in coming months, maybe in January, February, that there would be another offensive, there would be another attempt to gain control over Kiev and Odessa and other cities of Ukraine. Would you agree that the goal of Kremlin, of Vladimir Putin, is still the same?
I have no doubt whatsoever that the goals of Vladimir Putin themselves are the same. I mean, there might well be, I think it's highly likely to be people around also fairly close to the Kremlin leadership that is trying to say to Putin, this ain't going to work. So let's aim for something more limited. But I doubt that Putin will buy that. And the indications that are there is clearly that he's now busy de facto rebuilding a new Russian army. But the old Russian army, the one that he tried to build after 2009, failed miserably. And now with the mobilization and training, we don't know how many hundreds of thousands of men, it's a question of rebuilding a new Russian army. And there's no doubt whatsoever that he will try a new major offensive against Kiev, against Ukraine at some point in time during the winter or the spring.
How is European Union getting ready for that?
Well, getting ready for it in terms of accelerating the support. There was a decision taken the other day, 18 billion euros in financial support. European support is now bigger than American support. American support slightly more on the military side, European support slightly more on the financial side. Other countries as well, South Korea, Japan, to mention some others who are also giving their billions to sustain Ukraine. And that is the brunt of the effort. Or add to that, of course, generators and things that are needed for emergency help to Ukraine when we have these ongoing terror bombings of Kiev and the cities.
Mr. Bildt, do you think Ukraine is ready to defend itself and to defend European continent?
So far. I mean, Ukraine has surprised. We know for certain that the Kremlin expected Ukraine to sort of be defeated fairly quickly. And in all honestly, Western intelligence sources or estimates say the same. They thought that the Russian army was much bigger and much more capable and more powerful than turned out to be the case, and underestimated both the will and the ability of the Ukrainians to resist. And I think that remains the case. I mean, the Ukrainians are getting increasingly competent, increasingly strong in their defense efforts, as we've seen. And the Russian efforts are really struggling.
And if we try to analyze how the world has changed, because, you know, it's December 2022, inevitably 2023 is coming. What would be your, analysis of this year? How has the world changed because of the war?
Oh, of course, it has changed fundamentally, primarily, but not only Europe. We've seen an enormous strengthening of transatlantic cooperation. We've seen Sweden, Finland joining NATO, to take that as an example. But we also see it all over the world. We see Russia sort of leading global cooperation. They are sort of turned into pariah nation, pariah state. And we have all seen Ukraine also transformed. Go back a couple of years in time, Ukraine and Russia were indeed countries that were not the same, certainly not, but friendly to each other. And now Ukraine has been turned by Mr. Putin into the sort of anti-Russia that he himself has been talking about. And the security and stability of Europe has become a function of the stability and security of the Ukraine. So it's a fundamental transformation, long-term to the enormous detriment of Russia. I mean, foolish policies in the extreme by President Putin, but it also has numerous other effects that we will see playing out over the next few years.
Don't you think, I mean, I know that the common attitude of the Western countries to Russian leadership and Vladimir Putin personally, but if we try to take a look on his achievements, if there were any during this year, don't you think that he has proven his power, maybe even? The whole world is, upside down because of him. And isn't it that he has achieved this goal to pay attention to the whole world, to pay attention to him, to write down his name in history books? What do you think about that?
Well, he's certainly written himself in the history books, that's for certain. I can agree with that. But if the world is turned upside down, the rest of the world is up and Russia is down. And that can't have been his intention. I mean, there's no question that Russia, by his decisions, is entering a period of a time of troubles that will be prolonged. The economic and political time of troubles for Russia that will be prolonged and will be very difficult. It is very, very difficult to see any good end for either Mr. Putin or, sorry to say, even for Russia of his decisions of February 24th.
When we met previously here in Riga, you told me that you've met Vladimir Putin a couple of times, you know him personally. Could you explain what is this obsession about? Why wouldn't he stop? Because obviously he understands that the prospects are not good for himself and for Russia. Why isn't he trying to find a way out?
Well, I wouldn't say that I know him, but I mean, trying to understand him, he's become, seems like it, and there have been a number of signs of this in recent years, but it's been accelerated, obsessed with his particular version of Russian history. He wants to go down in Russia as a success of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great and Catherine II and whatever. And Ukraine has become an obsession for him. We saw it to some extent 2004 in the Orange Revolution. We certainly saw it in 2014-15, and we see it now. He simply can't accept that there's a Russia without controlling Ukraine, and he fears that he will go down in Russian history as a loser.
And the last thing, Sweden will head the European Union next year. It's very important status, but what would it change in terms of European attitude to and European policy towards Russia, Ukraine, and the region in a whole?
Well, it's been quite amazing because if you go back towards the beginning of the year and even immediately after the Russian invasion, there were a lot of people who were speculating about sort of European Union countries being divided and not being united enough and not being willing to do what it takes. The European Union has shown amazing strength and unity during this year. And when you look at the program of the Swedish presidents of the European Union during the first half of next year, it is to accelerate that trend. You've seen the Swedish government, new Swedish government itself, stepping up quite considerably the help to Ukraine. And the aim is to coordinate that help even better, to make it more long-term, both the military side and primarily, I would say, the financial side, which tends to be underestimated how important that is. So that, as a matter of fact, is the number one item on the agenda for the Swedish presidency of the European Union next year.
And Sweden is becoming a member of NATO, as I understand, maybe even next year.
We would hope that. We have a local problem with Turkey and ratification.
Well, we know that.
But apart from that, there's no doubt that you will see Sweden and Finland becoming members of NATO. I think, as a matter of fact, the Swedish Prime Minister is in Riga today, together with other Prime Ministers, to discuss defense cooperation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bildt. Good to see you on TV Rain.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times. They got us on the 6th day of the war in Ukraine.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We left Russia, but we kept going. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia, the war, and Russian society in English as well.
Kherson is Putin's 3rd major defeat in a row.
What is wrong with the Russian army?
Stories no one else can tell you. Hear it right from the source. Subscribe to our channel.